Hi everyone, good afternoon. Near 2 o'clock. I'm going to start slowly and then lead right into the next session. My name is Hilton Juden. I'm one of the organizers along with Ariana Lizani and Alish Longwane of the conference today, in whose place. I'm at the School of Architecture and Planning at Wits University, and alongside History Workshop, we want to welcome you again for those that have been here since this morning and those that are joining us for this afternoon session. I'm very pleased to be able to chair the session today. It's the third session. It's called Lost Buildings, and we have a really fantastic group of speakers from wildly diverging areas, focused a little bit, I think, around my favorite topic, architecture. So I'm going to introduce them and their papers briefly, and then each of them will be speaking one after the other for, say, 15 to 20 minutes. I'll try to keep it quite tight so that we have enough time. From what I've seen, the discussion certainly grew as the day went on, and by the last session, we really needed that full hour or something close to it to enable both the speakers themselves to ask questions and have a small discussion amongst each other, and also to start to bring in all the people attending today. So a reminder, yeah, please keep your mics muted if you're not speaking, your cameras off, and post as we go along questions or anything of interest in the chat. If you need to direct it to specific speakers, please do so. But it's great to see the messages going to everyone so we can all share in some of these conversations that are starting to happen alongside the ones on the screen. So welcome again, everybody. I'll start now with an introduction of our speakers today. The first speaker will be Pamela Gupta from Wits University. Pamela is a full professor at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University, and she writes about Lusophone India and Southern Africa, Portuguese colonial and missionary history, decolonization, heritage tourism, visual cultures, and islands in the Indian Ocean. So fantastically diverse subjects, and she's going to be speaking from her notes for a visual essay on the experience of Art Deco in South Africa. Our next speaker is my colleague, Brendan Hart. He's at Wits University. He's a lecturer in our school in History of Architecture, Urbanism, and Architectural Conservation. He's also a founding partner with Yasmin Mayat of Mayat Hart Architects, and an architectural and heritage consultancy is at least a part of their focus. He's going to be writing, he's written already, I hope. He's going to be talking on the rescripting of the Johannesburg West Dutch Reformed Church. Our third speaker is from out of South Africa, Nuno Kulo. He's from the University of Coimbra. He's in Oporto in Portugal, based he called himself communication designer, professor of design and multimedia at the Department of Informatics and Engineering of the University of Coimbra, and a researcher at the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies. His work addresses topics related to identity and memory by exploring the politics of image making and the archives of historic Portuguese trademarks and institutions. He's going to be speaking today on Statues Also Die, the Fortress of Cachau as Graveyard of Portuguese Colonial Legacy. And our fourth and last speaker is Nabil Essa. He's a practicing architect with a background in fine arts and a master's degree in landscape urbanism from the Architectural Association. In 2002, he founded his practice, Office 24/7 Architecture, which focuses on unique curatorial and design methodologies in combining spatial understanding with innovative ways of reinterpreting cultural space. He will be talking today on the building as artifact, from prison to museum. So thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to start first with Pamela Gupta. It's about 3 to 4 minutes past 2, and we'll run it, Pamela. I'll indicate on the side if it goes along over 15 minutes. But please go ahead, share your screen, and begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Hilton. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the conference organizers and also for putting together a great program and this panel, which I love the idea of lost buildings. So I'd like actually us to think a little bit more about the lostness of these buildings that we're all contemplating on this panel. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. See if that works.
Yes, we can see your first image, and I'm sure it's on to me. Go ahead.
Okay, that's not exactly the first one, but it doesn't matter. It's on a loop, so it'll just keep going. Okay, so just to contextualize, this is a really new piece that I sort of started developing, and I've been trying to, after living in Joburg as a foreigner for 15 years, I feel kind of finally ready to maybe write something about the city that I live and call home. So I'm putting together a book of essays, hopefully, an idea of thinking about localizing the worldliness of Joburg through ideas around infrastructure and affect and aesthetics. And so this is sort of one of the sample chapters that I'm really at the beginning stages of. So any feedback is most welcome. And I'm thinking through this idea of the ornamentation. Okay, so I'm going to read. I'm going to skip portions of the paper just in terms of time, and the longer version is on the Dropbox or on the Google Drive, I should say. Okay, so introduction. I start with a quote from Jeff Dyer. We sucked our smoothies. Mine had a protein supplement, sitting on a wall by the beach, and I made notes for an essay on Art Deco. And this is the British writer Jeff Dyer, and it's from an essay called The Despair of Art Deco, written in 2003, and it's in a book entitled, this is what sort of made me fall in love with it, titled Yoga for People Who Can't Be Bothered to Do It. Okay, so for this paper, I'm interested in thinking through the experience of Art Deco and locating it in South Africa. I take Jeff Dyer's inspiring and insipid, equally at different terms, article, with its focus on Art Deco in Miami, Florida, as a counterpoint for developing my own visual essay. I meditate on certain features of Art Deco that I witnessed on 3 separate architectural tours of cities in South Africa during the second half of 2018. That I was accompanied alternately by a motley group of urban planners, artists, and writers, no doubt influenced the way I perceived and photographed these architectural sites with their layered histories and renovations, something I've written about in terms of Beira, Mozambique. That I experienced Art Deco by ultimately driving in 2 locations and walking in 1 location through these places becomes my methodology for approaching African cityness and its built environment. And that's something I'm not going to really discuss here, but I've written about in terms of Southern Joburg and its Portuguese Madeiran community. My musings on Art Deco are threefold. I first look at the facade of Art Deco and what perhaps lies behind, below, above, and alongside these buildings. I then contemplate the typologies of Art Deco buildings in these 3 cities that I saw and photographed, and offer a template of Art Deco styles. Third, I address certain Art Deco features that caught my eye for the South African case, specifically light fixtures, fonts, lettering, and paint colors. That they are simultaneously forms of infrastructure and affect in the South African case also attest to their enduring role in city life. I conclude on a less despairing note than Dyer and ponder the role of the Art Deco enthusiast instead, and the way in which the incompleteness of Art Deco in South Africa compels a response of conviviality following the work of Francis Nyamjo from its frontier African urban residents and viewers alike. All right, so the second part of the paper is sort of thinking about the experience of Art Deco, the history of Art Deco in Johannesburg and in Springs and Durban as well, and this idea of the driving versus the walking flaneur. So I'm going to skip over to my third part, which is Art Deco musings in South Africa. And again, a quote from Jeff Dyer. Art Deco, after all, means nice looking, or more exactly, not as nice as it looks, end quote. Walter Benjamin's Arcades project was an experimental work, a form of montage that juxtaposed photography alongside reflections on materialities as an alternate format for writing in and from Paris. In this section, I bring his musings on city life to bear on South Africa. Rolf Tiedemann suggests that Benjamin, quote, finds the lost times embedded in the space of things by following, quote, kaleidoscopic distractions to write about placeness. I'm interested in a similar pursuit. It was certain kaleidoscopic impressions of Art Deco, as well as their ability to provide a sense of placeness for South Africa's built environment. It captured my attention on my driving and walking tours, and it compelled me to write about and visualize it through an exploration of infrastructure and affect. Following Benjamin, then, I wanted to wander through and wonder about South Africa's history of Art Deco as a way to understand its present built environment. I decided to start collecting Art Deco ideas and features and put them together, just as Benjamin was prompted to with his Arcades project set in Paris, and Dyer with his writings set in Miami, in the form of a visual essay. I was also very much prompted by Ivan Vladislavich's writings on South African city life set in Johannesburg. He writes, quote, "In Johannesburg, the backdrop is always man-made. We have planted the forest that birds endorse. For hills, we have mine jumps covered with grass. We do not wait for time and elements to weather us. We change the scenery ourselves to suit our moods. Nature is for other people in other places," end quote. Mindful then of these distractions, I wanted to gather up my musings on Art Deco by way of 3 themes based on the curious details I collected from my driving and walking experiences of Art Deco in these 3 different South African settings. So part A, the facade of Art Deco, or the art of display. And again, another quote from Dyer. "It is not accurate," I wrote, "to say that the shabbiness lurks behind the facade of Art Deco. Art Deco is the facade. Art Deco is the most visible of architectural styles, arranged entirely for the eye. It's in color rather than to be inhabited." It struck me on my Art Deco tours that this architectural movement, following along the lines of Jeff Dyer's reflections, was really about ostentatious display of wealth, of power, of industry, of moneyed might and muscle. It very much functions as a facade, one that Ming Wei described as, quote, "the face or front of the building towards a public space, and a form of architecturing of the exterior that sets an order of visibility," end quote. Art Deco is a form of display that I both indulged in with my photographs, but I also wanted to puncture from within the facade. I began to notice small things as I zoomed in with my camera lens on certain South African details. I started to think about the inside versus the outside of these Art Deco fronts. I noticed the majestic views that Art Deco rooftops afforded of cityness more generally, just as the grand entrances below were heavily decorated with a range of features, tile work, statues, trimmings, etc. What happens to the floors between the heavily decorated bottoms and tops? Who occupies these spaces? Are they empty zones or living, breathing, working spaces? One Art Deco building in inner city Durban that Jonathan Kane and I wandered into had been partitioned off into thriving small businesses of tailors and hair salons inside. An important detail that I would not have noticed had I not ventured inside the building. Reminder once again of the enduring power of the facade of Art Deco, such that city residents like myself rarely enter inside unless for a specific purpose. We chatted with one friendly hairdresser and I took a photo of his self-designed, appropriately matched Art Deco signage. My encounter with this hairdresser, as well as the plethora of hair salon signs that I think you'll see in these photos that I photographed, plastered outside Art Deco buildings, made me reflect or contemplate on their relationality. And perhaps there was a reason why these hairdressing salons were located inside. The lure of the aesthetic, maybe moving them into these, for these entrepreneurial business people. And so it's a point then that requires further elaboration through careful historic and ethnographic research specific to South Africa's built environment and its multiple inner city Art Deco lined streets. And that's just a point I wanted to sort of think about and throw out for further development. I also remember the entrepreneurial young man who asked us if we wanted to buy the value building we had just entered. He could offer a good price, he called out, as we grabbed hold of its Art Deco styled banister as we descended the staircase. I also thought about the relational quality of Art Deco buildings. And here I'm reminded of Ruth's comments on improvisation and using the work of Abdul Malik Simone and thinking about this idea of the improvisation of these buildings next to each other and this idea of making do. Is there a tempo or rhythm that gets established between and amongst Art Deco buildings on the same street, like the row after row of them that we saw in downtown Springs from the car window? And what happens to those buildings not invited to join in on the Art Deco dance of sorts? In Durban, Jonathan and I had a compelling conversation about what happens to non-Art Deco buildings that are located next to Art Deco ones. Do their old or new owners start to feel the need to dress them up, to imitate or copy Art Deco by way of a fake version or a few casual elements thrown into the mix? Or rather to pull them in another completely different architectural direction so as to not compete with their stylized neighbor? Peering up, down, and sideways at these buildings from inside and out, maybe ponder how one goes about seeing the back of an Art Deco building. Is it even possible? In a phone conversation with the late Bill Freund, a historian of South African Art Deco aficionado, he pointed out the 7-story heritage Art Deco building that he used to live in Surrey Mansions, built in 1935, in Durban's residential suburbs. He only had 2 good fixed up sides on Curie and Cosby Roads, respectively, the ones that faced the more visible streets functioning as eye candy, he said, for the passerby, which in turn returns us to the power of the facade of Art Deco. Hilton, sorry, how am I doing on time?
Sorry, just unmuting. No, you're doing okay. Please go.
Okay. Second part, typologies of Art Deco buildings. Another quote from Dyer. Effectively, the Art Deco experience is the hotel experience. Here I disagree with Dyer, but then again, his experience is based on Miami, where it's largely a tourist hotel experience. Instead, I suggest the worthiness of thinking of Art Deco in relation to the historical specificity of a city. And I think that was a comment that was brought up as well earlier in terms of planning and museums, as opposed to viewing it as a worldly architectural design that more or less presented itself the same everywhere during a particular epoch. As well as worth looking at the layered processes of renovation that buildings have undergone in certain places, which is again something I've looked at more in depth for Mozambique, which then tells us something about a city's built environment, its past and present sense of placeness. I noticed that the Art Deco experience in South Africa is littered with a range of building types and motifs: municipal buildings, office buildings, arcades, private homes, inner city flats, and suburban apartment buildings full of refurbished flats. In Springs, we were given a grand tour of the perfectly, almost obsessively restored Art Deco fire station by the manager, who took pride in detailing all of its finer fixtures and features. We quickly took photos of several arcades we spotted during our driving tour of downtown Springs, places that felt busy, lively, and full of inner city residents toing and froing as they went about their daily routines, entering and exiting small shops located inside the arcade inner hallways. So in some ways, we could think about the arcade as continuing its function, and that's something I want to develop further through more ethnographic research. We walked on Art Deco styled alternating green and white tiles inside the majestic Johannesburg City Library and quickly took photos from the second floor before we were told to stop by the security guard on duty. We drove by the beautifully restored Customs and Excise building located at the Durban port before returning inland to find a suburban sea, the pastel blue, green, and salmon pink colored Art Deco apartment buildings on Musgrave Road in Berea, Durban. Jonathan and I smiled as we chanced upon a miniaturized Art Deco styled Protea Hotel, Edward, in Durban's beachside mini town that we visited on our last day there. Its existence proof once again of Art Deco's archanicity in Durban. So after 3 tours together, Jonathan and I began cataloging 2 opposing Art Deco styles we were witness to in 3 different places. We named it Muscular in places like Springs and Johannesburg, cities that not coincidentally were mining centers, in which we linked directly to themes of colonial ostentatious display, work, industry, masculinity, apartheid racial inequalities, land, silver, and chrome. We named it Cake Style in Durban, an Indian Ocean port city that also had a long history of seaside tourism. And was included as a stopover of the Union Castle cruise liner in the 1930s, something I've written about elsewhere, which we then linked to themes of colonial white leisure, of the oceanic or nautical, decorative, tropical, femininity, frills, and pastel colors. Perhaps the naming of these alternating styles, muscular versus cake, made sense only to the 2 of us, but it did make a return to Dyer as a springer of what I was to witness in these different places of South Africa. His description of Miami was very dissimilar to what we experienced in Springs and Joburg, perhaps more akin to Art Deco New York, but not so far off from the tourist tropical oceanic dream space of Durban. And then my last section, excuse me, Art Deco features or Art Deco as infrastructure. And again, another quote from Dyer: "An Art Deco lampshade bathed the Art Deco sheets in an amber of Art Deco glow. When we drew back the curtains, the Art Deco spell was broken." In this section, I want to briefly contemplate certain features of Art Deco that I saw on my South African tour. I'm less interested in their ability to disappoint, as is the case above for Dyer in Miami, but rather in their continued capacity as part of city living. My response to Dyer would also be that Art Deco has simultaneously endured as a form of infrastructure in the South African case. In other words, I became curious about and focused my camera lens on certain features that held an effective register for me. Here I follow Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin in their suggestion to rethink why we study certain infrastructures in certain places as a way to say something about placeness. In other words, what can these detailings possibly say, if anything, about South African city life? Here I'm reminded of Italo Calvino's focus on certain detailings such as corners, window gratings, and banisters during his strolls of European city life, whereas my focus became light fixtures, fonts, lettering, and paint colors. I peered up at a functioning Art Deco wall lamp inside the Springs Firehouse, noticed Art Deco styled wooden reading carrels in full use in the Joburg City Library. I saw from the passenger seat of a car an Art Deco placard advertising an arcade in downtown Springs and freshly painted Art Deco styled font stating loading zone on the street in front of Durban's Excise and Customs House. I zoomed my camera lens onto small, perfectly gold painted seashells and snails I saw on blue painted fence posts at the Durban port. My phone conversation with Art Deco resident Bill Freund included discussion of the pastel paint color palette offered by the trustees of Surrey Mansion for its biannual repainting. I would also add that my textual and visuals focus here on those original Art Deco features that have been retained in South Africa's built environment. Put another way, it's a form of reckoning with the incompleteness of the Art Deco built environment we face today by responding with a disposition of conviviality following Nyamjo, instead one that allows for recognition rather than denigration of what once was and is no longer. Thus, I would rather say that I saw light fixtures, fonts, lettering, and paint colors as signs of Art Deco put to creative use, of thoughtful care being taken, of pride in past workmanship and present workmanship, and of their continued use value. Certain Art Deco infrastructures are still very much put to practical use by a racially diverse set of South Africans in day-to-day urban living, and for whom these buildings retain a sense of home and or work or belonging. I would also argue following Bettina Malcolm-S and Dorothy Creutzfeldt's work, who write about Johannesburg specifically and show that since the early 2000s, major rebuilding has not been possible, both from a built environment and financial perspective. Instead, there's been a specific focus on renovating what is already there. It is small, hopeful acts of repair following Stephen Jackson that take place instead to maintain stability, and which in this case I saw in the continued use of Art Deco lamps, chandeliers, fonts, and street signs, and carefully chosen paint colors for trims of buildings. These features then say something about Springs, Joburg, and Durban, its distinct places with enduring senses of self, and are very much part of the respective infrastructural and affective cityness today. Okay, and I just have like 3 more minutes, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Part 4, by way of a conclusion, or Art Deco enthusiasm as opposed to despair. And a last quote from Dyer: perhaps Art Deco generates a kind of despair. In this last section, I want to write against Dyer's despairing and disparaging of Art Deco in Miami with an enthusiasm for Art Deco in the South African case. Perhaps Dyer had Art Deco in New York in mind as he wrote negatively about his Art Deco experience in Miami. In some sense, though, and here I follow in Dyer's footsteps, Art Deco touring the world over is always a relational experience. I myself felt compelled to counter Dyer's comments on Miami with a focus on Springs, which is second to Miami in Art Deco features, and my own visual essay. I also constantly compared Springs with Joburg and Durban, weighing up my Art Deco experiences in each. Along with enthusiasm comes Art Deco enthusiasts, much like myself, Jonathan Kane, and the motley crew of writers and urban planners, which included also Ruth, I should say, who graciously gave us a tour of Joburg, who joined us on our Art Deco walks and drives. It also includes the Durban inner city resident who, recognizing the value of particular Art Deco buildings, saw Jonathan and me as potential buyers who might be interested in ownership based on its heritage design. As well, we should consider the late Bill Freund as very much an Art Deco enthusiast. It is his insightful comments that are woven throughout and to whom I dedicate this visual essay. It was Bill who briefly explained to me both the pleasures and difficulties of living inside an Art Deco apartment building. In our phone conversation, Bill tells me that Art Deco has allowed for generous proportions, beautiful views on 3 sides, except south facing in his case, polished wooden floors and elaborate glass tile work. He points out that the lighting in his flat is nice. The lighting in his flat is nice, but Art Deco is not really about lighting in a way that architecture is today, he says. His windows are rather, quote, high and narrow too. Surrey Mansions has continued infrastructural problems with an outdated steel lift that is too costly to repair and constant plumbing problems that cost the body corporate an arm and a leg to repair. There is also an Art Deco phone booth in the lobby that has undergone a recent renovation, even as it is awkwardly placed there and has no use value, he tells me, beyond being a heritage reminder of a past time and place. We end our phone conversation with his telling me how he takes care of and pride in living in Surrey Mansion amidst a diverse group of residents who have chosen it purposely for its Art Deco features. In other words, I'd like to suggest that Art Deco endures its particular South African infrastructure that a range of residents experience on a daily basis in these 3 cities. As frontier Africans following Nyamjo, we encounter, innovate, create, and dwell inside Art Deco. Moreover, I believe architectural movements such as Art Deco compel us to respond affectively to it, to make it resonate with each of us. It reminds me again of Bill and a comment he made in passing that when he first moved to Surrey Mansions, he tried to match the Art Deco outside with an Art Deco inside in the form of styled bookcases. He felt compelled to do so, even as his preference was for another era, a different imaginary, he tells me. In the same manner, I felt compelled to experience Art Deco in South Africa as both a driving and walking flaneur, to write about and photograph it, combining text and image, to think about architectural features as a form of infrastructure and affect simultaneously. It is a form of meditation or musings in a Benjamin sense, a series of notes in the form of a visual essay in a Dyer sense, to think about African cityness by way of its placeness, affect, and Art Deco built environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela, and thanks for the visual essay. I'm sure especially the architects amongst us will have a lot to say. I did notice the 2 distances that you seem to be working. One is at a distance, looking at the facade, and then zeroing in on a detail. And it's a kind of in-between distance that seemed to be missing, but we'll talk about that later. That's interesting. I think there is something about Art Deco that brings that about, you know, the kind of facade focus, and it's sometimes at a loss of the spatial, but we'll talk.
Yeah,
Brendan, we'll go next to Brendan, and I'm sure, yeah, it's also been of great interest to him, who might be, a secret fan. Please go ahead, Brendan.
Great, let me just share my screen. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see what I have on my screen. So thank you to the conference organizers for allowing me this opportunity to present. The research that I'm going to be presenting has come out of my master's dissertation some time ago, and sort of a continuing development of some of these ideas. So my presentation is going to be on the rescripting of the Johannesburg West Dutch Reformed Church. So a Dutch Reformed church building, if you, in a South African context, always feels familiar. It looks, and this is not by accident, like hundreds of other Dutch Reformed churches across the country, familiar landmarks in small towns and suburban city, early 20th century suburban settings. Now, the Johannesburg West Dutch Reformed Church is not what it initially appears to be. Now functioning as a progressive mosque in an increasingly diverse Muslim community after its closure as a church in the 1990s. Now, this is not a unique situation to this particular building or community, but is rather a sign of the social and physical changes experienced in the post-apartheid or post-colonial South African city. So often it's a case of formerly static environments that were controlled, where communities and people couldn't change and interact, suddenly changing and suddenly having to respond to new social and circumstances. And I think what makes a Dutch Reformed church building particularly potent as a symbol is its symbolism of colonial and apartheid power and prejudice. And that makes the conversion of the church to a mosque even more powerful as a symbolic gesture. Now, to understand the layered meanings behind this, it's quite important to understand the origins of the church architecture and the church itself. So the early origins of the Dutch Reformed Church and its architecture, the architecture is not benignly conceived. It's quite specifically created and quite specifically constructed as part of the construction of Afrikaner identity in the early 20th century. And the history of the church is very closely linked to the rise of Afrikaner nationalism and the apartheid state. Now, the Dutch Reformed Church arrived in South Africa with the arrival of Dutch settlers in 1652. And initially, the church and the state, which was effectively the Dutch East India Company, were inseparable, with all ministers being employees of the company. Now, for a period of over 100 years, this Reformed Calvinist beliefs of the Dutch Reformed Church were the only permissible religion, with freedom in the Cape, with freedom of religion only coming in 1795 after the brief British occupation. And it's this combination of Calvinism and capitalism that exists in the Dutch Reformed Church that became very powerful and very influential to the settler community, with this idea of being Christian and therefore being a member of the Dutch Reformed Church often being equated to being civilized. Now, ideas of segregation emerged quite early on in the Dutch Reformed Church, with separate services being held for different racial groups. Initially, these were done as a concession by the church, with the proviso being that they were done for the weakness of some members, perhaps suggesting that they're not scripturally justified. But later, they became part of the grounding of a lot of the ideas of segregation of the apartheid state. So the rise of Afrikaner nationalism and the Dutch Reformed Church are again quite closely linked. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you're getting a rise in a largely poor, newly urbanized Afrikaner community, both in the urban centers of Johannesburg and Pretoria. Now, this is a community who's coming to the city searching for work because of the unsustainable economics of farming, unsustainable farming methods, the Roman Dutch inheritance law, and also very largely because of the aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War, with things like the British scorched earth policy displacing enormous numbers of Afrikaner farmers and their families. So this process of urbanization was often incredibly traumatic. And I'm going to read a description here by Henrik Hoffman, who arrived in Joburg in 1933. And he says, "Man, I felt like a rabbit thrown into a cage full of dogs. You don't know which side to run. Wherever you look, there are people. I wasn't used to this many people. It was a frightening discovery to walk in the streets. I was far removed from the open plains of the Free State, and to be in Johannesburg was a terrible thing." And this rapid urbanization really concerned the church. And they were concerned that these poor urban Afrikaner communities living in proximity to people of other races might lead to things like social intimacy and potentially even eliminate race consciousness. This, when paired with a vigorous policy of Anglicization by the British colonial government post-war, really sort of made the church and the Afrikaans community feel like they're very much on a back foot, with the idea being that being Christian and being Afrikaans was absolutely central to the Boer identity. So language becomes a rallying point. Now, the Dutch Reformed Church becomes central to this rise of Afrikaner nationalism and this fear of a loss of language. The church is often referred to as the fortress against which the total onslaught against the Afrikaans identity can be defended from. So the church becomes a center point and starts to echo a lot of the strong nationalist and religious themes that start to appear in the works of Afrikaner writers of this period. And it's not by accident that future apartheid Prime Minister D.F. Malan, who's an ordained Dutch Reform minister, sees something as like the church as the means by which to guide and forge our people. So there's this very strong connection between the church and state. And it's the church and the state are largely inseparable, with the state in many respects, the church initially supporting the state and then the state supporting the church. And it's only in the 1980s really when the church starts to question and challenge a lot of the sort of the basic foundations of the apartheid state. And only in 1990, with the sort of unbanning of political parties, free releasing of political prisoners, that the Dutch Reformed Church actually confesses and accepts responsibility for the injustices and sufferings that it perpetuated under apartheid. Now, setting this sort of social and political background for the church as a community, the church as a body, then allows us to understand how this relates to its architecture. So the architecture of the Dutch Reformed Church has evolved in a number of stages. The initial architecture of the Dutch Reformed Church, if you look at the top left image here, it's the Groot Kerk in the Cape, starting in the 1700, is varied in architectural style. It's often quite accidental. It doesn't have a overriding or guiding principle. Later on, after British occupation of the Cape, a lot of Dutch Reformed churches start to follow a neo-Gothic style, as you can see in these three examples along the bottom here, which is very typical of all religious buildings at that period of time, Anglican, Catholic. They all are following this reasonably consistent architectural style. What the rise of Afrikaner nationalist consciousness does is creates this need or this desire for a more specific Afrikaans architectural style. Now, this was led by a pair of architects, Gerard Moerdijk and Wynand Louw, and they spoke of an Afrikaans architecture. And when they speak of an Afrikaans architecture, it can be interpreted as meaning an African architecture that is distinct from the colonial Cape Dutch and British styles. And by African, it doesn't necessarily mean indigenous, but representative of place and space, and more specifically dealing with the idea of space and place being the Highveld, being separate from the colonized Cape. So between the 1930s and 1960s, the debate on what is appropriate church architecture played out in the popular press. And eventually it is Moerdijk's ideas that really start to take precedent. And Moerdijk starts to outline a series of principles for what he feels are the correct language, the correct style and type of church for the South Afrikaans community. So he just puts out 9 key points in his 1935 description, Kerkboue for South Africa. And they are that churches must be built out of locally available materials, must be purpose-built with the purpose immediately apparent. They must grow out of their site. They must express the nature and personality of their owner. They must be harmonious of form, be well proportioned. They must have a life. They must have atmosphere. And most importantly, the building style must be Volkseie, or a nation's own. So what you have is this expression, and in many respects, if you look at those principles, many of them describe sort of modernist functionalist ideas about architecture, but it's describing this architectural style. And what Moerdijk was proposing is a move away from the neo-Gothic architectural style associated with Catholicism, with Anglican Church, towards initially a Romanesque. Well, initially an interpretation of the Cape Dutch, as you can see here. These are prototype churches that he designed and published, and later to Romanesque, or what he would term a Neo-Byzantine style of architecture. So his argument was incredibly convincing, and it actually led to church communities across South Africa abandoning or demolishing their older, unsuitable churches and often building new buildings designed by Moerdijk. So one cynical way of looking at it is he was not just an idealist, but also a fantastic businessman. Now, there is, at the same time, this sort of connection between the church and the rise of modernist and functional architectural thinking. So Moerdijk's Neo-Byzantine style of architecture, an example of which you can see here on the right, embraced the Art Deco, embraced later modernist architectural languages. It makes use of exposed face brick, a common material on the Highveld, which sits comfortably with a Protestant consciousness. It has an honesty to it. And this, for a period of 30, 40 years, was the predominant church style until in the 1960s and 1970s, it was replaced by a Pretoria-based architect, Johan de Ridder's tent kerk, or tent church designs, which are really a purely functional and spatial expression of the church as an expression of the community, it's having its own specific architectural identity. Similarly, it's important for us to understand the origins of Islam and Islamic architecture in South Africa. So the arrival of Islam in South Africa coincides with the arrival of the Dutch Reformed Church. So in 1652, Islam arrives in South Africa with the slaves brought by the Dutch East India Company from what they referred to as their Indian Empire. So these slaves, many of them were Muslim, and in addition to these slaves, you have a number of higher ranking Muslim political prisoners being brought to the Cape because of their political influence in their individual colonies, and later being released and forming the core of the Cape Muslim community. So while the Dutch Reformed Church was initially the only allowable form of religious practice in the Cape, Islam was practiced underground. Now, with the Cape Muslim community being separated from their geographic origins and also being geographically very diverse and culturally very diverse, Afrikaans becomes the adopted common language. Now, there are claims that Afrikaans was actually created by the slave community by adapting the Dutch spoken by their colonial masters. It becomes this way of communicating amongst this diverse community, with, interestingly enough, the first known written record of Afrikaans as a published language being written in 1856 using an Arabic script. And here's a picture of that on the right here. So from that, after that first wave of Muslim immigration under the Dutch East India Company, there's a long period with no additional immigration. And then in the 1860s, you have what is known as the second wave of immigration. And this immigration consists mostly of indentured laborers brought by British colonial powers to Natal to support the labor shortages, particularly in the agriculture and sugar industry. These were then joined by so-called passenger Indians who moved to Natal and later to the Transvaal as traders, as business people. And with them came the construction of new mosques and madrasas. Muslim traders moving inland often faced major prejudices and discriminatory laws, and trade almost became the default profession because there were very few other options. So it's perhaps unsurprising then with all of this that the South African Muslim community has always been active in resistance to oppression, with the mosque forming the center of both religious life as well as the center of resistance and sort of the political life of the community. Now, after the sort of decline of the apartheid state from the 1980s onwards, you have what is thought of as a third wave of Muslim immigration. And in many senses, that's still continuing today. And these immigrants have perhaps more in common with South Africa's original Muslim community, coming from a very diverse range of backgrounds from in Africa, Somalia, Malawi, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, and from Asia, you've got India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, as well as an increasing Turkish business community. So bound by their shared religious identity only, they form a core of the new Muslim community, and many come as political and economic refugees, resulting in what can be seen as an increasingly vibrant and multicultural Muslim community.
15 minutes.
Thank you. Islamic architecture in South Africa similarly evolves out of this. Early mosques, such as those ones we saw previously, followed the pattern of the churches of the time. They were neo-Gothic buildings. Cape mosques differ very little from early Dutch Reformed churches. What is interesting is when you start to look at the mosques developed by the second wave of immigration, the Indian Muslim immigrants. Now, there's very little that speaks about the origins of these mosques, but people like Scott Leroux, when looking at what he calls the Transvaal Mosque, theorizes that it's actually the influence of Indian mosque architecture that has created this sort of new hybridized architectural style. And you can see here some examples of the Transvaal Mosque in Johannesburg, some early examples, the Juma Masjid, Newtown Mosque, and the mosque in Fitas, that speak about this Transvaal mosque style, simple buildings that are responding to locally available building materials, responding to the local context. Now, these first permanent mosques develop as a response to the community. And later on, particularly from the 1990s onwards, you have a new wave of development of mosque architecture, which can be seen more as a pan-Islamic style, almost claiming the Muslim community's place in the international Muslim community. Now, how does the Dutch Reformed Church that we're looking at fit into this? So there's enormous social change that is happening in South Africa at this time. You have a process of graying happening in the eastern suburbs of Joburg, where predominantly Afrikaans communities are being replaced by Muslim Indian communities. These leave church buildings empty, which are congregations consolidating, and these are bought and built up by other communities. In this case, with the Johannesburg West Dutch Reformed Church, it's bought to be converted to a mosque. Now, as you can see, it's one of many of these churches in the community, very similar styles developed on that architectural language of Moerdijk himself. So the Johannesburg West Dutch Reformed Church is bought, it is converted to a mosque. It becomes this very much symbolic of the changes that are happening in South Africa at that point in time. The church itself, based very much on those principles of Moerdijk, although on a very constricted site, is quite easily adapted to become a mosque and is one of many buildings in its immediate context. Here we have the church hall converted into a more pan-Islamic mosque on the right. Nederduitse Hervormede Kerk, which becomes a Hindu temple, or a Dopa Gereformeerde Kerk, which is converted into a house. And all of these are symbolic of the change. Now, when it's converted to a mosque spatially, it's quite a simple exercise. Simply removing furniture, changing the orientation of the building. Later on, things like the inclined floor are changed so you don't have to pray uphill. But really, it's what this building represents. So the question is whether this building represents a hybrid type of architecture. So hybridity as this sort of post-colonial idea emerges because of the mixing of different races, different peoples, and theorists like Barber contest that hybridity emerges in a third space where you have conflicting cultures, conflicting ideas, peoples coming together. And in many respects, the Dutch Reformed Church can, in the case of this example, can be seen as a conflicting space, as a space that is encouraging the hybrid to emerge, a hybrid that is different from both of its origins, the mosque and the church, and is creating something new. So initially, the hybrid of the Dutch Reformed Church in Johannesburg West, which becomes the Masjid ul Islam, changes very little externally, which is quite interesting because it allows for what I've like to think of as almost this simultaneity. It's both a church and a mosque at the same time. And in many respects, it allows its history and its to continue, for the communities to gradually change and merge from one to the other. But over time, this is changing. So from its initial changes, very minor changes have been made incrementally over time, until here we have got a picture of a as yet unrealized 2018 proposal by the architectural firm Counterspace to further remake and reimagine this building. Now, what does this mean for the building?
20 minutes.
I'll quickly conclude. So the building obviously can be seen as a hybrid of different communities, different ideas, different spatial and religious practices. But it's also quite interesting to look at the building as a fossil. It's a fossil that is this relic of a previous period that is, in many respects, lost a lot of its power and a lot of its significance, and gives an opportunity for reinterpretation. It gives an opportunity for reinterpretation by its new communities and a re-understanding of the social and religious spaces. So the emergence of these hybrid spaces and identities in the post-colonial and post-apartheid city offer an opportunity to look at and understand how communities are dealing with the complex social and physical realities of Johannesburg. And the former Dutch Reformed Church, now Masjid ul Islam, provides us with a potentially successful and living hybrid response to this. And while it may be viewed as a possible prototype for post-colonial or post-apartheid mosque, it's perhaps better understood as a prototype for the layered process and engagement that leads to the emergence of this building and the new community. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. We'll move on to Nuno. Are you ready, Nuno? You want to share screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so welcome to Johannesburg. We're sorry you couldn't be here, but another time.
Yeah, another time. Are you seeing full screen?
Yeah, we're seeing full screen. Please go ahead.
Cool. Thank you. My presentation is titled Statues Also Die, the Fortress of Caxias was a Graveyard of Portuguese Colonial Legacy. Located in northern Guinea-Bissau, the town of Caxias was where the Portuguese first landed in this area of the West African coast in 1446. My presentation will focus on the story of 4 statues that are deposited here from the moment they were erected, going through its dethronement and relocation, as well as several moments in which they were featured in film productions, while addressing their presence at the fortress in present times. So I'll begin to, so the fortress of Caxias was built in 1588 to defend the first Portuguese trading post founded in the region. In addition to securing the Portuguese military presence, the fortress supported the trade in ivory and fabrics, as well as enslaved people that represented more than 80% of the Portuguese economic profits in the region. It is believed that from this port, over 1 million enslaved people were taken to Brazil. So one can tell the story of the Portuguese presence in what is today's Guinea-Bissau by telling the story of these men represented in these 4 statues. I will now tell the story of each man in chronological order, not the order in which these statues were erected. The first one is of Nuno Tristão, the first Portuguese navigator to reach the current coast of Guinea in 1446. He was immediately killed by local people once he arrived, an event that reveals a history of resistance from the very first moment. His statue was erected 500 years later, designed in 1945 by António Duarte and Alberto José Pessoa after being awarded first place in a competition inaugurated 2 years later. The second one is of Diogo Gomes, the first Portuguese navigator to enter the rivers of the Kingdom of Gabu in 1456. His explorations allowed the permanent presence of the Portuguese in the region. His statue was erected 500 years later, designed in 1956 by Eduardo Tavares and inaugurated 2 years later. Here we see the statue overlooking the Pijiguiti port, where a massacre was conducted by the Portuguese after a strike that took place there in 1959. And this event provoked the beginning of the armed struggle 4 years later. So the third one is of Honório Barreto, a governor of Cacheu of Cape Verdean origin between 1834 and 1859. And his statue was erected 100 years later, designed in 1956 by Vasco Pereira da Conceição and Maria Barreira, inaugurated in 58. And the fourth one is of Teixeira Pinto, a Portuguese colonial military in the so-called pacifying wars, which I found it an oxymoron, this expression, that took place between 1912 and 1915. His statue was also erected 100 years later, designed by Euclides Vaz after being awarded first place in a competition inaugurated in 1955. There was also another monument to him in Bissau, a bust inaugurated in 1929, and I wasn't able to identify its authorship. So in this aerial view of Bissau, the original locations of the monuments are identified, and I would like to quote Tiago Castella, who says that, and I quote, "Visual and sculptural representations located in urban areas are integral to urban planning, having a persistent role of a colonial tradition of memorialization." And he goes adding that memorials contribute to the spatial violence of unequal urban division, end of quote. So one can tell the story of these four statues by looking at films that features these monuments. And I chose cinema because the moving image adds a second layer of meaning to the statues. So in the films this meaning is literal when the Guinea-Bissau was, of the films produced when Guinea-Bissau was still under Portuguese rule. But it's the meaning is resignified on the films produced after its independence. So I could identify 11 films. And please note that these monuments were erected during the dictatorship, all of them, during the dictatorship in Portugal, the longest in Europe, when there was a reinforcement of Portuguese colonial projections and fantasies. So the first one is Guinea, Cradle of the Empire by António Lopes Ribeiro, produced in 1946. And the film consists of a panoramic view of the territory of Guinea and the Portuguese administration, carried out during the so-called scenographic mission to the colonies of Africa. In this one, we can only see the bust of Teixeira Pinto. The second one is Presidential Visit to Guinea-Bissau by Ricardo Malheiro of 1955. It documents the first ever visit to the colonies by a Portuguese president. In this film, Craveiro Lopes is seen paying a tribute to the statue of Nuno Tristão. He then goes to inaugurate the one of Teixeira Pinto, and then he also pays a visit to the fortress of Cacheu as well. So the third one is Ardent Land by Augusto Fraga from 1960 and pictures landscapes and cultural manifestations of Guinea like a series of moving image postcards. All four statues and the fortress of Cacheu were shot for this movie. Several shots of the fortress of Cacheu. And some of the statues are repeated in different angles. The fourth film is Act of the Achievements of Guinea by Fernando Matos Silva, and is a film from 1980. And he was produced 6 years later after the end of the colonial war, as it is known in Portugal, or Liberation War, as it is known in Guinea-Bissau. It's a hybrid film, both documentary and drama, dealing with the Portuguese presence in Guinea, staged in the form of theater and criticism. It features archival images from the war, and the script raises questions about the consequences of colonization and its so-called heroes. It shows only one statue. The fifth film is Sans Soleil, or Sunless, by Chris Marker. It's a French film from 1983, which mixes documentary and fiction, filmed in several locations around the world, including Guinea-Bissau, where Marker played a role in the early days of the National Film Institute of Guinea-Bissau. The stills of this film shows the dethroned and dismembered statues after the independence. We can see like some of the statues in these images and some unidentified parts. So the sixth film is Morto Nega, or in English that he has two titles. The first one being Death Deny, or Those Whom Death Refused, is a film by Flora Gomes from 1988. And it portrays in an expressive, a touching way, the experience of the War of Independence in Guinea-Bissau, fusing contemporary history with African mythology. It was the first independent Guinea-Bissau feature film and tells the story of the Minga during the last years of war and the struggle against the drought that was felt on the early stage of the new independent country. In this scene of the film, the Minga announces to the children that are playing inside the fortress of Cacheu and they're playing wars, and she announced to them that the war is over. Later on the film, two statues appear in the background of a scene, like ghosts from the past, and these ghosts are Diogo Gomes and Nuno Tristão. Just an extra note, in 1967, Flora Gomes, with three other people, returned from Cuba, where they were sent by PAIGC, which stands for African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, to study film. When returning to Guinea-Bissau, the mission given to them was to film the struggle. So I like this idea of also cinema, the moving image being also part of this struggle. So and these images that these four people produced signaled the birth of the Guinea militant cinema. So the seventh film is Years of War by José Barahona. It's a film from 2000, and it's a documentary about the colonial or liberation war, and it features a collection of testimonies of former Portuguese combatants and archival footage from the Portuguese Army Audiovisual Archive. The next one is The Embassy by Felipe César. It's an artistic film produced in 2011, in which is used one continuous shot that consists in a guided tour by Armando Lona through an album of the historical archives of Guinea-Bissau, inherited from the colonial period. The album features images and subtitles that reveal a colonizer system of representation. The landscapes, peoples, and monuments appear under the mark of domination, as if they were part of a collector's compendium. Here, in this still, Armando Lona points to an image of the fortress of Cacheu. Later on the movie, I could identify the statue of Nuno Tristão. It's on the right page, but Armando Lona does not point to this one. And later on the film, Armando Lona points to an image of the statue of Teixeira Pinto. Cacheu, also by Felipe César, is a film produced in 2012 and tells the story of the four statues that is the subject of my presentation at the fortress of Cacheu. The performer Joana Barrios presents in a lecture format, and also the film it's also in a single shot. The story of the statues, featuring images from her own film, The Embassy, that we just seen, Chris Marker, Sans Soleil, and Flora Gomes, Morto Nega, that I also showed here. I must add an extra note that this presentation was also inspired by this film. I got to know of these statues by watching this film back in 2012, and later I was able to visit Cacheu for another project 2 years ago. Visions of Empire by Joana Pontes is a documentary from last year about the way the Portuguese Empire and its history were imagined, documented, and publicized from the graphic record from the end of the 19th century until the revolution that ended in 1974, the Portuguese authoritarian political regime. The film features one picture of the inauguration of the monument of Teixeira Pinto from the archives. And finally, Cacheu Kuntum by Welket Bungé, also a film from last year. Bungé, who was born in Guinea-Bissau and raised in Portugal, produced this smartphone documentary film captured on his recent visit to Guinea-Bissau to rediscover his roots and redefine his cultural identity, as he says. He also adds that the film does not intend to only make a statement, but also, and I quote, deconstruct and at the same time report, denounce, end of quote, some figures who were part of that period and who can be associated with Cacheu's history. Even though Bungé mentions the 4 statues and the fortress in the synopsis of the film, no image associated with them is shown. In his words, and I quote, "This film seeks to rub together the memory of the past of slavery in contrast to what can be Guinea-Bissau of tomorrow, taking into account the images we see, how the people interact with each other, how this light means vitality, and at the same time, how I myself, newly returned to the city, perceives things," end of quote. By not showing any of the colonial remnants, one can say that Bungé symbolically dematerialized the colonial statues. So if these colonial statues were symbolically dematerialized by Bungé, what remains of their materiality? The bronze cast statues are inside the fortress of Cacheu today. Several pictures that I found on the internet reveal different locations inside the fortress, inside but in different positions, and currently in these positions that I visited a couple ago. I found interesting the idea that these colonial vestiges were deposited in the very same place where the Portuguese first landed in the region. So here are some pictures of the remnants. Even though it is almost absent from the films I've shown, the bust of Teixeira Pinto can be found deposited in a storage room at the basement of the nearby regional government headquarters. If the bronze parts are located in the fortress of Cacheu, a graveyard as I titled my presentation, what happened to its pedestals in granite? I will show 3 cases only that represents 3 different approaches. The pedestal to the monument of Diogo Gomes can still be found in Bissau. Even though one can still read the name of Honório Barreto engraved in stone on its formal pedestal, this block of granite was resignified. A bronze portrait of Che Guevara was placed on its surface, and it is now the monument to this revolutionary man that visited in 1967 the liberated territories from the Portuguese over the course of the Liberation War. At the place where the pedestal to the monument of Teixeira Pinto once stood, the Popular National Assembly was erected. In this picture, we can still see it, the pedestal, but just like the statues, it's now vanished from public space. And this is my last image, and I will conclude now. So the story of these statues, and I quote, converted in images at the mercy of the historical inconstancy, seems to illustrate the statement that no image is produced naturally, but according to who has the power to do it. each time an order falls, the raised statue becomes the ruin that celebrates its fall. End of quote, by Maria Beatriz Marquilhas. And just an extra note on the title of my presentation, Statues Also Die, is a reference to a namesake essay movie from 1953 by Chris Marker, Alain René, and Ghislain Cloquet about historical African art and the effects colonialism has had on how it is perceived. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuno. That was really interesting. And we'll move to our last presentation before we go on to discussion. Are you there, Nabil?
Yes, I am.
Great. I'll tell you when I can see. Yes, we can see the first black page.
Okay, brilliant. Well, what a powerful, visually powerful presentation. Hard act to follow. But I'm going to bring us back to Johannesburg and to Constitution Hill. And my paper is entitled Building as Artifact, From Prison to Museum. When open-air site-specific museums focus on buildings, spaces, and place as the artifacts to which content and narrative respond, a tension between past and present emerges. These in situ artifacts are displaced through the passage of time, through the development process of adaptive reuse. My interest is to revisit the heritage and spatial decisions made during the Constitution Hill project in Johannesburg, and to consider ways of working with such toxic sites that allow buildings as artifacts a presence that is about unmaking boundaries and unbinding history. In 1996, in 1996, the process commenced for the development of Constitution Hill from a disused prison complex to the site of the Constitutional Court and a museum. Buildings were demolished, commemorated, relocated, and new buildings were erected. The site was transformed both in its physical materiality and the way it performs in and engages the city. If we assume the project intention was to transform the site as an act of reparation for the atrocities enacted on the site, their ramifications, and the systems that the site represented, then how effective were the heritage, architectural, curatorial, and programming decisions made in the formation of the precinct? Does the interpretive context allow through the mechanics of museums offer the prison structures within Constitution Hill precinct the dual role of memory and transformation? The criteria around the notion and status of heritage practice in this context needs interrogation in terms of how these artifacts are able to unlock regeneration. My intention is to consider ways of intervening on toxic historic sites, ways to interpret, interrupt, and transform such sites with tangible, spatial, colonial, and apartheid evidence. Manetsi refers to expert influence in codification and quotes Smith in saying that management and conservation become things that are done to sites and places, but are not seen as organically part of the meaning-making process of heritage itself. This process is obscured and redefined as external to the process of heritage. This paper looks at the process of heritage assessment that took place during the heady drive towards the making of the Constitutional Court project. I want to revisit the heritage and spatial decisions made in the formation of the idea of Constitution Hill. They were expedient and had far-reaching implications. The site is significant in its physical evidence of an early history of incarceration. Sorry, just getting the slides right. And that spans a period from 1893 to 1983, when the prisons were moved to Diepkloof Prison and the prisons on site closed. In 1996, a dialogue ensued between the National Monuments Council, NMC, and the judges of the Constitutional Court. The NMC, which was established as part of the apartheid governance under the National Monuments Act of 1969, initially took a preservationist stance to the site. In 1998, the whole site was declared a national monument and with a proviso of some demolitions. In 1999, the South African Resources Agency was established and replaced the NMC. Today, the site is configured to a master plan that formed after and around the winning court design and begs questions. What reading, what cohesion do the fractured components of the site offer? How in the palimpsest of the site do the prison layers emerge, and to what effect? What is erased? What was left behind? Partially demolished, commemorated, reconstructed? What was added, and what narrative emerges? What are the new urban connectivities? What are the new boundaries? Urban design and conservation decisions that were made reconfigured and adapted the site to new use. From an architectural and sustainability perspective, the 2021 Pritzker laureates Lacaton and Vassal offer an ethos of keeping and incorporating existing buildings when developing a site. Their practice begins every project with the process of discovery, which includes intensely observing and finding value in what already exists. This value is considered without the weight of cultural significance, regardless of age, and purports reuse and adaptive reuse. Nostalgia for the past is absent. Rather, Lacaton Vassal seek transparency, openness, and luminosity with a respect for the inherited and a quest to act responsibly in the present. I posit this ethos towards existing infrastructure in relation to the debate around the demolition of the Waiting Trial block. ATB, I'm going to call it. Cape Town architects Vivian and her husband Derek Jaffa acted as advisors to the court judges prior to the launch of the competition, and they identified the highest flat point of the site, namely the location of the ATB for the new court. How they came to be tasked with this crucial role is unclear, but it is on their advice and on a series of site demolition options that they drafted that made the site attractive for the court. The Jaffa's influence is marked by a series of layout sketches and accompanying commentary notes dated the 13th September 1996. A decision on precisely where to situate the new buildings had to be made in conjunction with a decision as to which of the historic built fabric could or should be retained. The argument presented by the Jaffas formed the basis of the NMC declaration for the precinct just prior to completion. The ATB occupied an absolutely pivotal position on the site. The Jaffas believed it to be the most negotiable. Despite their Cape heritage experience, the Jaffas were looking at the site from a singular perspective, that of best architectural position for the court, and not in terms of the palimpsest of the site. Prince explains that the judges had been advised by heritage experts in Cape Town and that the ATB did not have particular architectural significance, but the regional community were aware of the structure's historic importance. Prince's personal opinion is that if the Jaffas advised the judges that the ATB did not warrant conservation, then this could be because of the different value placed on 19th century buildings by conservationists in Johannesburg and Cape Town. Prince reiterated to the Chief Justice that the Chief Justice was adamant and completely opposed to the suggestion which Prince put as, maybe we say the competitors can or can't. You may demolish, but you may also incorporate the awaiting trial building. As a result, the option was not presented in the competition brief. The judges felt that these buildings were already decaying and pushed against the conservation view of the heritage agents. The judges made the demolition of the ATB a precondition to moving on the site. Why they would be so adamant on issues they had no skill or experience is unclear. When looking at the 4 other finalists of the competition, and in the words of the jury, the symbolic formality, colonial classicism, and monumentalism prevalent, it is sobering to think that one of these entries could have been selected the winner. Interestingly, the massing of one of the finalists, Jeff Stacey Design Partnership, the image shown here, if read simply as a massing of accommodation, offers a glimpse of a potential of adaptive reuse of the awaiting trial building into the court. Gavissa laments that for an inexplicable reason, and quite frankly unforgivable reason, the heritage consultants who originally advised the Constitutional Court said the buildings had to be demolished to make space for new buildings. But the rub is that in terms of heritage, the waiting trial block was by far and away the most important site on the complex. The ATB was built in 1928 to hold awaiting trial prisoners. Tens of thousands of men passed through its large and overcrowded communal cells. Political prisoners, the treason trialists of the 1950s, the PAC past resistors, in the 1960s, the Soweto Youth in the 1970s, the ANC in the 1980s, were held in special cells separated from other prisoners. We went through a big iron gate to number 8, the ATB, and were led up some stairs to section D. This section was a big hall of a cell divided into numerous cells of maybe 2 by 2 meters, recalls Godfrey Malloy. But his description cannot reverberate on actual walls, as these no longer exist. Coombs points out that the effectivity of spaces like Constitution Hill lies in the power of oral testimony and the notion of witnessing both survivors and place. Nelson Mandela stayed for 2 weeks in the ATB and notes our enemy had gathered us all under one roof for what became the largest and longest unbanned meeting of the Congress Alliance in years. Through the statement, Mandela shifts the perspective of a space of incarceration into a place of activism. O'Regan, a constitutional judge, explains her position. I'm not a great fan of prisons, and I don't feel this huge regret when prisons are razed to the ground. People had suffered enormously, very often unjustly, that something can rise phoenix-like from the ashes, which is an antidote to it. The architect Mosayada reinforces this idea. We decided that it was important to create an accessible public space at the center of Constitution Hill that celebrated the right for people to gather, a right that had been denied to most held there. The argument by the judges that the buildings were going to ruin is not the point. For the ruin still is evidence and catalyst of memory. Demolition is erasure, and commemoration is a barrier to the project of memory, as it creates another layer of design and meaning to navigate. The argument that the new fabric that replaces the old offers the site progressive spatial transformation is valid, but this question still stands. Were the intentions of liberating the space through a new urban layer necessarily in conflict with the conservation of the ATB, or was the decision expedient? In South Africa, and in Johannesburg in particular, very few sites exist of tangible evidence of the systems of injustice that make up our history. Erasure of such sites had larger ramifications counter to the memory building and writing of history project of the democratic South Africa. More concerning is that one of the Jaffa layout options submitted to the judges shows the demolition of number 4 with its isolation cells. I'm just going to put that up. Number 4 was built as a black male prison in 1904 by the British. It held a notorious identity for Black South Africans during apartheid. The very existence of this option highlights the skewed perspective offered to the judges at the time. To mitigate the impact of the demolition of the ATB, the court architects decided on 2 commemorative gestures. Sorry, my slides are not going quite right. That is number 4. To mitigate the demolition of the ATB, the court architects decided on 2 commemorative gestures. The first was to use the stair cores and extend them with tall glazed boxes, allowing for vertical landmarks. The gestures, while contributing to the presence of the new court on site, denies the narrative tangibility of the ATB. The second gesture of using red bricks from the demolished ATB in the court building and stepped walkway aligned to the stone walls of number 4 prison are evocative and bring a poetic depth and texture to the material palette. Both gestures work to support the architectural design of the new court. All conflicting narratives had to surrender to the form of the new court work. So the square does not fully function as a platform for civic activism. The ATB is watered down and literally spread thin over the site. The notion of building a phoenix rising from the ashes is the new enforced narrative. This bombast continues with the decision to reconstruct the ATB room in a new position. The construct of fragmenting the ATB is ambivalent. It does not express the prison processing, spaces of incarceration, and relationships between prisoners, warders, and visitors. The strategy renders the ATB as symbolic. This abstraction is watered down through the different kinds of commemoration and attempts to frame the ghost of the building through the keeping of fragments, reusing of brick, and marking of the building footprint, all make rendering the ATB impotent. The designers were occupied with seeing the ATB as a building rather than a place of meaning, of associations and memories between people and space. The symbolic gestures are in the service of their narrative, that of making the architecture and the rising of the phoenix from the ashes of the judges, not the prisoners. The visitor's room, with its wall of wire mesh separating the visitor and prisoner, was part of the ATB. This was where outside met inside. This portion of the building was supposed to be retained as part of the court-winning design. However, planning exigency requires that it be slightly moved to the west, explains Prince. The demolition and reconstruction of this portion of the building further distorts and separated the artifact and its meaning. The project seems to offer neither space of leisure and amenity for economic opportunity for neighboring residents, nor is there residential accommodation on site, in part of fear that housing would reduce the status and nature of the precinct. The flow of the city, its buffers, road and pedestrian networks are too entrenched to meaningfully connect with the site. The urban gestures encouraging traffic are best realized through the programming of the sightseeing bus to stop in the square. A larger project of the Hill is to rewrite over the past, allowing layers to surface as reminders and evidence of past atrocities, but also as spaces of resistance. There's an automatic value associated with preservation. There's an automatic devalue associated with demolition. Decisions that have been made on what is inherited and what is erased. Is there a strategy that could emasculate the power and monumentality of these buildings? For instance, could the removal and demolition or reversal of all water spaces render the prisons different? Can these structures be made to be memorials commemorating resilience through injustice and not monuments? The palimpsest of the site does not read clearly between the dual narratives of past prison and present public precinct. There's a loss of understanding of the boundary of the prison layer. The selection and preservation of some buildings with a demolition of context and a new fabric overlaid make the preserved buildings isolated artifacts. A vision for the precinct can be considered through a paraphrasing of the preamble of the Constitution. Constitution Hill as a place for the people of South Africa to recognize the injustices of our past and honor those who have suffered for justice and freedom in our land. And I add, Constitution Hill is a place to mark the resilience and resistance of oppressive systems, a place of civic activism, of restitution, transformation, and reconstruction with the task of reorientating history in a democratic South Africa. Mbembe refers to a reorientation of history as a question of abolishing the moment in which the self is constituted as the object of the other. What spatiality of place is deemed significant for reorientation of history? How do we evaluate between tangible buildings, walls, landscaping, trees, earth mounds, courtyards in negative space, roots, circulation, boundaries? What adjacencies, what measure of old with new produces the tension to expose the site's layer and offer present and future trajectories? A palimpsest is a surface on which the original writing has been erased to make way for new writing, upon which traces of the previous layer is still legible. The identification of Constitution Hill as a palimpsest defines a methodological direction for the precinct. This identification by the Heritage Education and Tourism team of a memorialization of the various layers of history on the site came later in the process, after key decisions were already made. The notion of palimpsest as a driver for decisions around demolitions and interventions to avoid complete erasures could and can offer a fertile reading of the site. Delport refers to District 6, to the District 6 Museum as a place for working with memory. Homi Bhabha talks of the act of rethinking self in the company of others who have similar experiences, the building of communal memory. Mbembe notes that each of us needs the memory of the other. We will have to learn together, and in so doing, to repair together the world's fabric and its visage. Framing the museum, that is Constitution Hill, as a place of making communal memory, of oral history, and of embodied experience offers the institution a vital purpose. The building artifacts that make up Constitution Hill all fall into the category of structures that memorialize a history of specific power relations, where the past is constructed from an apartheid and colonial perspective. Is the preservation of these structures reinforcing a system of power? The difference with buildings as artifacts in a museum is that they can be made to represent both power and resilience. The Hill narrative, through its museum function, speaks of resistance. How can the liberation struggle's resistance to oppression be materially felt in the urban fabric? Do the architectural and urban decisions made in making the Hill reinforce the oppressive narrative? The spaces need to be problematized. The site's reconciliation theme seeks liberal status, where the narrative is rendered meaningless when seen in tension with the everyday and structural inequalities. The site needs to include voices that do not fit the Rainbow Nation theme, and voices that consistently contest the hegemony. The layer of interpretation that is allowed in the context of museum affords the potential to reinterpret, rewrite, and shift the narrative from one of oppression to one of resilience. The effects of the past and the present is a process to unravel. It needs to be made, to be told, to be shared, to be grieved, but it also needs to be unmade as an act of liberation, of visioning, a future that is better, and unmaking that is transformative. The museum needs to be porous and fluid to the making and unmaking project. How do the buildings as artifacts achieve this override? Van Merle explains mapping loss as a process of remapping and reimagining is then to challenge to and refusal of these hegemonic forces that drew the maps and legislated the spaces in the first place. This idea of a precinct pregnant with possibilities and still fragile to difference, to change, a porous architecture, a platform that allows a space for process and progress is compelling. The site is seething with stories of trauma and injustice. Can the development of the site offer a form of reparation? Can it be constructed with the mechanisms that make amends for the individual and collective trauma of the site? The symbolism of the Constitutional Court on the site was evoked as an act of repair, and the museum an act of healing. What amenity, what easing of trauma does the site offer? Mbembe asks, in what ways can their lingering past be revealed, contested, reimagined, or expunged? How do we avoid the commodification of culture and envisage a different economy, different social relations? The need to demythologize that history and put it to rest. This is the work of the Hill. He goes on to argue that the decolonization of buildings and public space is inseparable from the democratization of access. Such a right to belong, such a rightful sense of ownership has nothing to do with charity or hospitality. It has nothing to do with the liberal notion of tolerance. It has nothing to do with me having to assimilate into a culture that is not mine as a precondition of my participating in the public life of the institution. It has all to do with ownership of a space that is public, common, good. In conclusion, events at the Hill are much more visceral in achieving this notion of a space of transformation. The Afro-punk, human rights, sorry, I'm gonna see if I can go back. So that slide's disappeared. I can get it back there. The Afro-punk, human rights, and Basho Uhuru Youth Festival have opened the site to new and young audiences and have allowed a process of rehabilitation and unintended catharsis. It is through lived experiences like these that people build their heritage. How does the oppressive history cradled in the prison and the promise of the Constitution form a hybrid, a platform that is about difference, ideas from outside of hegemony, temporally eccentric, interruptive, and in between? How can the site act as a catalyst for critical engagement between foundations of the past and an imaginary of the future that shifts beyond a rhetoric of reconciliation and a promise of renewal? The site needs prompts, platforms, and facilities to allow change and transformation to enact itself here. From an architectural perspective, and taking a cue from the recent events and programming of Constitution Hill, the site can offer platforms that are safe spaces to thresh ideas, that are spaces people of color and marginalized groups feel a belonging, amenities that give emerging voices the space and process for agency, a square to gather in, a field to perform in, and an auditorium for dialogue, a new archive as resource and repository for projects of rewriting, recentering, and transformation, a library as a medium for connectivity to information, allocation for affordable housing, infrastructure for events, fairs, conferencing, markets, and concerts, allowances for entrepreneurship and economic opportunity for small and emerging enterprises, all within a clear revision and strategic development framework for decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. Okay, I'll just go through some points, but I'd like to invite all the panelists or all the speakers to share with me now some of this discussion, and hopefully to have between you an extended discussion, because there obviously are things that carry across, and some of you might be interested in picking some of them up. I'll just pick up a few going through, or rather than as a question, and then once you've started talking, I invite panelists to please, not panelists, the delegates, anyone listening in, to start raising some questions to individual speakers in the chat alongside, and I'll pick up some of them, and then maybe we'll go on to raising hands. So, I mean, what I did notice, and is always a fear when you talk about lostness or something, is that there's some nostalgia or some sense of nostalgia behind, and there was none. In none of the speakers and in none of the discussions has that appeared. So although very diverse, I did find some things carrying across when you go down or drill down to some of the languages. So with Pamela, this notion of layered histories was really important, and you can see it with all the speakers. Her idea then is different to an architect or a planner of wandering through the city. To observe, to photograph, and to see these details is an interesting one. We do that, by the way, but with very specific intention, and your openness, I think, to wandering was really interesting to me. And the way you photographed, as I mentioned earlier, either at a distance with a facade or right into the detail. And I didn't have a sense of space, and I wonder if that's something about Art Deco, you know, and what is it about Art Deco that sometimes rings of something other than nostalgia. You know, you do think of places like, I guess, Miami Springs now, and New York when you think of it. What is interesting to me is that it's that other international style, you know, it's not modernism. And what is it then? So with Brendan, I think this the nationalist consciousness, of course, is important, but also the question of style comes up again, you know, and in architecture, it's a difficult question. What was interesting in terms of Moerdijk's and Moerdijk's set of directives, or the points that you put down, is this notion of regionalism, you know, which was already apparent in his and continues to appear in a lot of our architecture that has to do with what we sense is a local way of dealing things. But it's what you point out, the hybridization of style, of representation, that becomes important. And this notion of conversion is very interesting. It's obviously in relation to religion, but also in relation to the buildings themselves. So not renovation, not restoration, but conversion is interesting to me. Reinterpretation, so that you're not left with just a relic or a fossil. With Nuno, so yeah, I mean, the films were wonderful to see, because you raised the films as a dialogue rather than just narratives. And the narratives went across, but you introduced it as a dialogue across ages or generations, between filmmakers and artists or ideologues at some point that have presented those statues. And the statues lived and then died, then disappeared, and then went into storerooms, and some remained. And it felt also familiar. We've seen this over the last 20 years, you know, all across the world, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, more recently in the States. We never went quite through that same thing of storing our statues. They kind of just overnight disappeared. I know with Verwoerd, which I grappled with for a time for some exhibitions, that he was there and then he wasn't. And then there are a couple that are remaining and, you know, became globally contested, or part of a global contestation around statues that is of enormous significance, and once again placed the struggles in this country as part of a global struggle, which was really powerful over the last few years, and continue to play out across the globe. So these statues never disappeared, they were stored, but they're still around. So these marks of domination. You talked about marks of domination are very interesting to me. And then Nabil, yeah, we share the same, like, yeah, wonder what the hell happened there with that competition, you know, and it's really fascinating to see you go back to look at its early stage. I didn't know about the Jaffas involvement, so it's something really important to see. And it's the last lost building. I mean, it's the most lost building, you know, because you show us once it's gone, it's gone. There is nothing left. And although sometimes, and I'm more recently thinking a lot about, you know, the buildings that were burnt down, that continue to fail and are neglected, that there's real reason behind them being burnt down, obviously, and the neglect through which they're going. And it was raised in an earlier a discussion, which I think is really important, this notion of not wanting those things around anymore, but yeah, what do you do with them is really important. You talk about a palimpsest. It's sometimes dangerous because things just pile up there, but I'm interested in I think it's Mbembe's notion of reorientating history is really important. And then you balance those two things of resistance and resilience, which come up in so many disciplines, but when applied to architecture become really interesting, you know. I mean, can you even apply those terms of resistance and resilience to architecture? And if you can, how do you? So I just want to open it to all of you. Anyone jump in, ask each other questions, and yeah, please respond. Maybe start with Pamela and we'll go through.
Hi, okay, thanks, Hilton. Those are great comments and productive points for thinking further. I think your point about there being no nostalgia is a really important one, that's across all the papers. And I think that's a huge step as academics, that we're not dwelling in the nostalgia of these sites. So analytically, I think it's really important, and I wanted to just emphasize that. Yeah, you actually made a really excellent point that I'm going to develop further now in the paper, this idea that the photographs are really about sort of this distance and this detail. And I want to then fold that in analytically to what I'm trying to do with the facade and the idea of going sort of inside, outside, you know, layered, these layered histories as well. So I haven't figured out how to bring the photos into the analytic work of the paper, of the text. So I think that's a really helpful entry point into that. So I'm going to take that further. Yeah, this idea of no sense of space. I mean, I think it's tied into a lot of things. It's tied into the light and when I could take the photos. I was also just using my iPhone crappy camera, to be honest. So I need to go back and take, you know, but also just this idea of driving versus walking and how I was able to take photos from the window versus, you know, so it's about vantage points as well. And I think I need to develop, those are also good points to develop further. Yeah, and I'm also thinking through this other, you know, what is this other national style, and and again, it's about trying to localize it, because it is about the relational qualities and the ways in which we see these international styles, but in these local contexts. So perhaps then more a focus on the motifs and the African motifs, and, you know, things like that would root it more in South Africa. I mean, it's something I'm still thinking about. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Also signage. I mean, the signs that appeared and building a sign is something of significance. Architects, you know, famously refer to learning from Las Vegas and those kind of important architectural texts, which preceded postmodernism.
Okay.
And Art Deco for me sometimes is, I don't know, an early sign of postmodernism in an interesting way. And its relationship to modernism. Well, there's a whole lot of things like that. So great. And maybe Brendan wants to come in and respond to.
I might have to pick your brain, Hilton, later. So thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe I can just comment specifically on your work, Pamela. I find it absolutely fascinating. Myself and my partner, we've been involved in a project at WITS where we've taken honors architecture students to document the Art Deco of Springs for a period of 3 years. And I think what's interesting is to, as Hilton said, to look at how you observe and understand the buildings as a non-architect versus how we have documented the buildings. And I think what's from that part of it, it's your understanding was, it's often it felt more experiential, whereas we tend to look at it more from an analytical point of view, understanding the building as a whole, understanding it through a process of drawing and documenting, where yours feels more sort of about the your emotive response to the building, rather than trying to critically understand it as an architectural construction. So I thought that was really, really interesting as a way of observing and understanding. And it's quite nice for me to see that as a way of removed from the lens of architect. So I thought that was very valuable. And I think Hilton's point about Art Deco being almost this early sort of way of thinking that you see a lot of in postmodernism is very valid. In the sort of documentation work we've done in Springs, a lot of the buildings in Springs, the Art Deco buildings, are refaced earlier buildings, or are literally, the way they're built doesn't differ from the way they were constructed a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades before. So the Art Deco is often only a skin deep or a facade deep. So I think that the way you picked up and spoken about the facade is actually quite relevant, because a lot of those buildings, the Art Deco nature of the building is only the facade. And I think that is really fascinating to understand. I think Springs is interesting as an example because of the direct connections with Joburg, but it's sort of the scaled down, more manageable way of understanding it. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating for me. Also, it's quite low tech in terms of how it's made. It's not sort of fancy high tech construction methods. And I think that's really interesting. But also it as a reflection of the social history of the space becomes really, really interesting. One thing that is interesting is probably at least 50% of the prominent Art Deco buildings in Springs are the work of a single local architect. So I think there's the power of a single individual to shape the visual narrative of a place, I think is really powerful, and it almost starts to become this sort of self-feeding process where if you're building in Springs, it becomes Art Deco, possibly even subconsciously, rather than it being sort of a conscious way of looking at the sense of architecture and making a place.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's really helpful, Brendan. Appreciate it.
Nuno, do you want to come in and join in, even though you're outside of South Africa? Please join us.
I'm sorry, I lost the first comments because so I don't know how to react, because like I had to get out of the Zoom call. Sorry.
Okay. So no, I was just raising some points around your film, your use of film as a dialogue across ages, and across architects, and in dealing with statues. I found this idea of the statues that eventually they pull down, they put down, they stored away, they abandoned is quite an important one. And yeah, I referenced other parts of the world where it's been somewhat different here, where many of those are still standing and become famously points of contestation, first with students and then with the larger population. And yeah, we still don't quite know where to store some of them. So maybe talk a little bit about, I had originally brought you into this panel because of the fortress. I thought would be, and the picture felt like a space or a building in which there was something. And that definitely was the most powerful building. I don't know if that's its current status, where those remnants are still sitting there, or has it changed? And maybe you can say something about the fortress as it currently is. And is it seen as something that needs to remain as an important heritage thing? And how is it dealt with? How do you deal with its horrific history?
Okay, so as I said, so the fortress was set up to, basically for the slave trade, so my reason to go to Cashel wasn't because of wasn't specifically because of the fort, but as a Portuguese, I found these images of the supposed Portuguese heroes, and I'm putting some quotation marks, being there, just sitting around. But I went there because the one of the only two museums dedicated to slavery, to the Portuguese involvement in the slave trade are built. One is in Angola, another one is in Cashel. So my main interest to go to Cashel was to see this museum that was, built in this 5,000 inhabitants small town of the northern area of Guinea. So that was my main my area of interest, and also I visited the fort because it's just there. But it's not the fort as it is now is not being explored because there's hardly any tourism in Cacheu. But it's not also like visible, very accessible. So I had to ask around who had the keys of the gate to be able to enter the fort. So so I don't think people or the government or people in Cacheu are paying too much attention to the forts, and I like that idea of this kind of symbolically forgotten place where it holds, it's a vessel, it's a container for all the remnants. So the fort is a remnant of the Portuguese colonialism, but also it holds, it encloses the remnants that were taken from Bissau. So bear in mind that Cacheu is like is a dead end. There's no, it's not like a passing route. It's like you go to Cacheu and then you have to come back to go to other towns. So I like this idea of the town being really far from the city center, from the capital city. It's 2 hours drive, more than 100 kilometers. And I like this idea, this effort that after independence they took down all the statues and they took it back to the place where the Portuguese first landed. So there's, for me, there's so much symbolism around all these actions of taking down statues and displace them to another place. And also I like the idea why I chose cinema is because these statues are objects, still objects, but yet the cinema is a moving image. So how do you picture an object that doesn't move with a moving image? And so I found that all the films that were produced and during the dictatorship, so it's not an illustration of a subjective idea. So all the directors that were working under the colonial regime were replicating the idea of the regime. But after the independence, and all these male directors were Portuguese, white male. But after the independence, both Portuguese and Guinea-Bissau directors, and the films I shows, like in the chronological order, is kind of intertwining narratives between both Portuguese and Guinea directors. They're talking about from their own subjectivity. So there is more like their own ideas. They're not talking through someone else. They're talking about them. So all these visions of these statues after independence and after Portugal became finally a democracy, it's very critical of our colonial history. And that I found very interesting, that all these films after independence are criticizing the presence of those statues there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Nabil, do you want to come in? I don't know if all of you are looking at the chats. There's definitely been questions and conversations raised with some of you. Nabil, I don't know if you're watching.
Yeah.
If you want to maybe talk generally and what the others have said and to any of the chats, please go ahead.
I can. I mean, I think on 2 points. One, you talk about the resistance and resilience of buildings. But when I look across the presentations today, there's also resistance or resilience in that Art Deco building or the church and the statues, that they don't go away. And it's very hard to make something go away. It's very hard to build something to make something, and it's very hard to make it go away. Which is, why the ATB was such a interesting thing to look at, because it took a lot of effort, but very few decisions to make it go away, and very quick. It was at a time of liberation. There was a kind of a drunken dizziness of democracy, and the judges wanted something something built. They wanted a vanity thing that showed this is the new South Africa. We are democratic, and we have this amazing constitution. And so things were done very upside down at that time. But because I work in museums so much, and we're busy on the Museum of the Constitution, that this notion of how do you tell oppressive stories? You know, we tend to tell oppressive stories in oppressive ways. There's always the oppressor and the oppressed, and you just keep reinforcing that narrative through these stories. And a lot of the museum work we've been doing have been shifting focus on how you see through a point of resilience. And I wanted to see how, or resistance. And that's why it was that Mandela kind of moment where he sees being in prison as a point of, you know, activism. And how can we see these spaces not through their past of their kind of oppression, but people who have resisted them through them, and how can we then continue that narrative, that narrative of resistance? And I think Cynthia asks, what do I think has failed at Constitution Hill? I don't think Constitution Hill has failed. I think it made expedient decisions. I think there's a great CEO at the moment and amazing programming. I think museums failed because museums are so irrelevant to South Africans in so many ways, because historically we could not trust museums. And so it's through events, through programming, through kind of different kinds of agency and activity that the site survives, you know. So that's why that Afropunk for me is a really like cathartic moment. It's this amazing moment where identity building is something that is exciting. It's about the future rather than laboring in the past. Completely understands the past, and that's where I think for me that has been a catalyst in understanding where Constitution Hill can go. And part of my writing this whole thing was also there is a lot of development happening, and there's a lot of development that has happened with public funds. And how can we write a strategy that then voices this kind of vision, you know, that to say that this is a place that must be that must be about reorientating history, that is the project of the place, and that's what everything it must do. It must be about housing those histories, voicing those histories, engaging that dialogue, rather than the kind of piecemeal way that this has happened, or also the nervous way that because the court is there, the space is almost like a don't touch me space, because it's seen as being prestigious. And so it doesn't get a kind of urbanity about it. It doesn't get bodies in it actually accepted events, and how to make it much more alive and engaging to these questions that then, you know, have the court as a face that can engage things, can engage issues like restitution or and inequality across so many faces, and that's why, yeah, for me the project was about. Also, I've been involved in Con Hill for such a long time. It was about seeing, you know, I was there in those demolition pictures of ATB. I was there taking those pictures. So it was a reflection also of my time looking at this, but also I wanted to look at something post-apartheid, you know, not to kind of be bogged down in that past, but to see how often liberal and progressive decisions are problematic or not well thought out enough.
You saw also the point Themba Middleman makes on the side there in terms of what you're saying about the difficulty with public space and the, you know, controlling behavior in that space, which you also mentioned, the irony, of course, the architects intending the demolition to bring about public space. And well, we know the impossibility now of arriving at, you know, what is this public space? I wonder if you can connect it, you know, earlier, both Tariq and Adima made this issue around the post-colonial versus the decolonial, and who's making those arguments, and are they still governed by colonialism, or are we, and it does seem, entering into a very new era of debate and discussion, not only who's doing it, but the terms on which it's made, and things like public space need to be readdressed, because maybe, yeah, we've got it wrong. Just as the discussion in the previous session around, museum as even maybe a valid or continuing valid building type for dealing with history, and what other spaces, I guess that's something you're also grappling with now.
Yeah.
Okay. Between each other, is there any questions or anything you want to pick up from the chats? Otherwise, yeah, Pamela, is that your hand? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, let me lower my hand. Okay. Yeah, a couple things. One is Gilles asked a great question in the chat about sort of this idea of Art Deco and the aspirational sort of Eurocentric aspirations of people, wanting to save the heritage. And I think what's interesting about the South Africa case is that that's going on at the same time that very other processes are going on with Art Deco. And that's what makes sort of the despair that Jeff Dyer talks about, is this sort of nauseating confrontation with people obsessed with Art Deco in these other cities. And the ways in which I think South Africa is a much more interesting and complex case as that's happening alongside other processes of reoccupying these buildings in interesting and unexpected ways. So that's one comment to that. The other thing is I just wanted to take on the nostalgia thing. So I took Hilton's comment to be a productive one about the fact that none of us were nostalgic in our reading of these buildings, which I think is a really important point, because you can get drawn into the nostalgia of what that place was at one point, and none of us did that. So that was my point I was trying to make from Hilton's point. And they're really interesting conversations that's going on in the chat. Svetlana Boym, I mentioned William Bissell, and they're really interesting ways to think about nostalgia as a reading of the present and what that nostalgia is about in terms of, what it's saying about the current political condition. And I think that's a literature that's really interesting, and there's still a lot more to be done on that. But I just didn't want that to be that's the point that we were trying to make in this panel, because that's not. So thank you.
Brendan, please go ahead.
Yeah, two things. One is just continuing on the point of the Art Deco and the saving of the Art Deco. In my mind, one of the reasons that there's not that level of fanaticism around the style, particularly in sort of the South African context, the context of Springs, is because the buildings are viewed from my observations for their functional value. A lot of these buildings are still working functional buildings. They are working as shops, as residences, as they were designed 80 years ago. So they are valued not because of their architectural style or their language or their decoration, but because they work. And they work as intended. And in many ways, that's almost the greatest success of the architecture, that you can design a building and it can be useful and valuable and functional for 80 plus years without needing to change it. I think speaks far more about the value of the architecture than its decorative quality. So I thought that was quite, it's a different way to look at it. And in many ways, I think that would almost cause the Art Deco in sort of small towns to save itself, because it's not being protected for the aesthetic, because it's got youth value. So I think that for me is an interesting way to understand and look at it. And then I just wanted to respond to one of the questions in the chat. It was about the response of the community to the conversion of the building.
So Lawrence Stewart, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So I had discussions with the Dominee who was involved in the sale of the building. And he said that he did receive death threats from certain sort of members of the community. But in general, it was actually a lot more amicable and well received than anyone expected it. And it was the choice of the community to actually sell it to a religious institution. And similarly, the Hafemeerde Kerk just down the road chose to sell to a Hindu community because it was a conscious decision on the part of the community that they wanted the building to continue with spiritual use and spiritual function. So I think that's quite interesting, that there's this connection across the community, that they would rather, this particular Dutch Reformed community would far rather that the church is used as a mosque than potentially some of the more conservative communities where they rather sold their church buildings to be converted into houses and residential use. So I think there's just perhaps a far greater understanding and connection between the different communities. I also think that we're dealing with communities here that have been slowly, inadvertently integrating for decades. So you've got the slow process of graying in places like Mayfair West that's been happening for 20, 30, 40 years, that it perhaps caused greater integration than you'd expect. And I think another side of it is the fact that the changes to these buildings have been slow and incremental. So you can still, as a member of the church, and a couple of the congregants have expressed this when I've chatted with them, is they say, but the church is still there. I might not go to it anymore. I might not be part of the community or the congregation, but there's this sort of echo of it in the urban landscape. And I think certainly for the former congregants, it's something that is far more palatable and understandable. But then when you're speaking to the congregants of the mosque, it's a functional transaction, and it's about the functional use of the building. It's about the building meeting needs, and there's very little nostalgia, particularly on the part of the mosque community, for the building as having the sort of previous religious function. They see it more as a space that is easily adaptable and easily functional as a mosque, rather than having to be converted in very complex and costly ways. So I think the attitudes were quite surprising in terms of how accepting, particularly the sort of the former church congregation was of the change.
Okay, thank you very much, Brendan. We've come to the end of the session, and I'm sure, yeah, but we haven't even really got speaking as much as we'd like with all the delegates, but there is a lot to talk about. What for me is really powerful is we're talking about building, but at the same time we're talking about it in these incredible dimensions. So across in a landscape, you know, nobody's just talking about the isolated building. It's in a context. This horizontal wide landscape, Art Deco cross springs or cross things, you know, the whole of Constitutional Hill, not just the individual building. The individual building in comparison to the whole site is not the thing. The church is not an isolated thing. It's part of a longer history, and, you know, the statues existing across the whole landscape, and then also the depth of time, you know, so it's not just a building in its moment, or even when it's been used, it's long afterwards, you know. There's a kind of a reversal of this nostalgia, not only looking back, but there's I think all of us have an attempt to imagine, you know, where's it going, or, you know, what's its purpose in the future. And I think that seems to drive a lot of the talks earlier, which is also of interest to me. Although it's a historical conference, it's a history workshop, it's a kind of an architectural history one. We're really talking about the future, you know, or future, or something we would want to imagine. And that's, I think, a great way to be looking at these things. So thank you very much, everybody. It's really appreciated, all the time you spent to pull together these things. And thanks for that wonderful chat. That in itself becomes another whole essay, which we'll try to pick up on in some ways. So we're going to break now for, I think it's 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for the last session for the day. Thank you.